After the birth of Jesus, up to his appearing at the age of 30, there's very little recorded about his life. These are referred to as the silent years. And today what I'd like to do is to see what we can find out about those silent years. We can start where we finished off last session. Jesus as a baby, after being dedicated to God. This is what we read in Luke chapter 2 and verse 39. So when they had performed all things according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own city, Nazareth. In the next verse we have an outline of the next 12 years. Verse 40 tells us, "And the child grew and became strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him." When we finished the last time, we said that we hadn't seen any wise men. Tradition tells us that the wise men turned up at the stable with the shepherds. But as we shall discover today, this was not true. The silent years that we talk about were perhaps not quite as silent as we thought. Matthew chapter 2 tells us of a few of the things that happened in the first 2 years after Jesus was presented at the temple. It also explains the reason for what was happening. So Matthew chapter 2 and verse 1. "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and we have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Herod then called the chief priests and the scribes together to find out where the Christ was to be born. And they told Herod that it was in Bethlehem of Judea. The chief priests and scribes told Herod what the prophets had said of Bethlehem. "For out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." From the visit of the wise men and the Old Testament prophets, it is possible to get some idea of what happened during those first 2 years. By putting the verses together, we get this possible order of events. Joseph and Mary leave Nazareth and go to Bethlehem, and Jesus is born there. Then they go back to Jerusalem after 8 days, taking Jesus to be circumcised. Then they return to Nazareth, and a month later they go back to Jerusalem for the purification celebration. The celebration of purification takes place 40 days after the birth of Jesus. Now, the wise men arrive about 6 to 12 months after the birth of Jesus and inquire about the child's whereabouts. By this time, Joseph and Mary are living in a house, and it's in a house where the wise men offer their gifts to this newborn King of the Jews. And we find this in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 11. "And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother." When King Herod hears of the visit of the wise men, he gets very, very concerned. He believes that the birth of Jesus poses a threat to his reign. So Herod sends his soldiers to Bethlehem to kill all male children who might have been born during the time that the wise men had suggested. Since 6 months to a year had passed following the birth of Jesus, Herod instructs his soldiers to kill all baby boys under 2 years. It was estimated that 40 to 50 baby boys were in Bethlehem at this time, and they were all killed. But Joseph, being warned about the massacre, quickly departs for Egypt, where he and Mary would stay until after the death of Herod. We read this in Matthew 2 and verse 13. An angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise, take the young child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and stay there until I bring you word. For Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night, and they departed for Egypt. And they were there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, Out of Egypt I have called my son. Because of the warning to Joseph and their flight into Egypt, Jesus escapes the first direct attempt on his life. Jesus' life and movements were always in line with what the prophets had to say concerning him. Joseph is warned that Herod will try to destroy Jesus, and he's told to flee to Egypt. They could have fled to any town, but in order for Scripture to be fulfilled, they had to go to Egypt. This was to fulfill what the prophet Hosea had to say. Out of Egypt I called my son. In verse 19 we read of their return to Nazareth. But when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Arise, take the young child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel. For those who sought the young child's life are dead. Then he arose, took the young child and his mother, and came into the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea instead of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned by God in a dream, he turned aside into the region of Galilee, and came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken of by the prophets, He shall be called a Nazarene. When we read of the life of Jesus, from being an infant up to 12 years, this is all that's written about him. And the child grew and became strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. The only way that we can try to understand just what happened during this time is to look at the way that Jesus developed. And the child grew and became strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. We need to look at the things that influenced Jesus from being an infant up to 12 years. After the dedication, we read, they returned to Galilee. He returned with Mary and Joseph, and this is all that we read in verse 40. And the child grew and became strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. That doesn't give us much to go on. Just 4 lines cover the first 12 years. And the only thing that we can do is to look at the conditions that he lived under. We need to look at his home life, the village that he lived in, and the lifestyle of those around him. We know what kind of home influences he had. His home was one of those that could be best described as a home of a godly working class family. Joseph, the head of the house, was a devout man who observed all the religious responsibilities that were expected of him. And Mary, his mother, she would be the one who would have the most external influence upon his development. Now, I like the way that Max Lucado describes in one of his books the humanity of Jesus, because he describes something that we don't usually think about. The Jesus that Mary knew. After all, she'd be the one who would have to feed him. The one who nursed him when he was teething or had a bit of colic. It would be Mary that Jesus would come running to when he was hurt or upset or maybe even afraid. We tend to forget that for Jesus to be tempted in all points as we are, he would have to experience every temptation that we experience. Don't you think that Jesus would be sometimes tempted to answer Mary and Joseph back? If when he was only 12 he could sit discussing the law with the teachers of the law in the temple, at 12 he must have known far more than his parents did. He may have been tempted, but I don't think he would ever answer them back. Think about this. Angels must have watched in amazement as Mary changed the Son of God's nappies. The universe would watch with wonder as the Almighty learned to walk. Jesus may have had pimples. It could be that his knees were bony. One thing is for sure, that while he was completely divine, he was completely human. He would feel everything that we feel. He felt weak. He grew tired. He was afraid of failure. He got colds, he burped, he had body odour. His feelings got hurt. His feet got tired, his head ached. To think of Jesus in this way seems almost irreverent. It's not something that we like to do. It's uncomfortable. It's much easier to keep the humanity out of the incarnation, clean the manure from round the manger, wipe the sweat out of his eyes, pretend he never snored or blew his nose, never hit his thumb with a hammer. It's much easier to stomach that way. There's something about keeping Jesus divine that keeps him distant, packaged and predictable. But don't do it. Let him be as human as he intended to be. One thing, however, is perfectly clear, and we really need to take this on board. He took part in everything that belongs to a man's nature. His birth was exactly the same as all human births. It was as a human he grew from infancy to boyhood. It was as a human he increased in bodily strength and mental power. Jesus is able to sympathize with every one of us in every stage of our existence, from the cradle to the grave. He knows by experience the nature and temperament of the child, the boy, the young man. He stood in their place. He's occupied their position. He knows their hearts. All those hidden waiting years, his home life would have an impact upon him. Jesus would develop and grow in exactly the same way and pace as all those young people around him. As Jesus developed, he would receive his education at home or from a scribe attached to the village synagogue. Jesus would find that his study of the Old Testament would be invaluable when he was preaching. His knowledge of the Old Testament would help him to silence his critics. It was his knowledge of the Old Testament that was used to overcome the temptation of Satan. As the child grew and became strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. This is what the prophet Isaiah prophesied of Jesus. For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of a dry ground. Then in verse 41 we find the only other recorded incident, the temple visit. In verses 41 and 42 this is what we read. His parents went up to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went to Jerusalem according to the custom of the feast. These two verses don't tell us much about Jesus, but they tell us a great deal about his parents. They were committed believers. Their faith may have cost them something, but they continued in the task that they've been given to do. Let's read on in verse 43. And when they had finished the days, as they returned, the boy Jesus lingered behind in Jerusalem. And Joseph, his mother, did not know it. Joseph and his mother did not know it. But supposing him to have been in the company, they went a day's journey, and sought him among their relatives and acquaintances. So when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem, seeking him. This was probably Jesus' first visit as a boy to the temple in Jerusalem. A Jewish boy became a man, a son of the law, when he was 12 years old. At the end of the week, the people travelled home together in large groups. Mary and Joseph didn't worry much about Jesus until the evening at the end of the first day's journey. Everyone met together in the evening. They knew that Jesus wasn't with them. They would think he was travelling with relatives or friends in another part of the group. It was only when they stopped for the night that they found that he was missing. Then Mary and Joseph took a day to travel back to Jerusalem. And they looked for Jesus in the city on the second day. It wasn't until the third day that they found him in the court of the temple, the place where the rabbis taught. So it was that after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. It was usual for students to ask and answer questions. And Jesus had joined a group and he was asking questions. He also answered the questions that the teachers asked him. And they were astonished at just how much he knew. Just how much Jesus knew and understood. How did Jesus gain such wisdom? And this is something else that we need to take on board. Jesus, although divine, was not born with exceptional wisdom. The knowledge that Jesus demonstrated was acquired by his studying the Hebrew Old Testament. It was this that enabled him to challenge the thinking of the Jewish leaders with questions at the age of 12. Jesus had to be very familiar with the Hebrew Old Testament as well as the skill of reasoning from the scriptures. When Joseph and Mary found him, this is what we read in verse 48. So when they saw him, they were amazed. And his mother said to him, Son, why have you done this to us? Look, your father and I have sought you anxiously. Jesus' simple answer to them was, Why did you seek me? Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business? This incident shows us that Jesus was fully aware of the great commission that he was called to fulfill and his relationship with God, even at this early age. No Jew would call God my Father, but Jesus already realized that he had a special relationship with God. Joseph was only his legal father. When Jesus said, I must be about my Father's business, this demonstrated just how much he knew. Jesus knew that he must do what his Father expected. All through his life, Jesus knew that he must obey God's purpose for him. Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know that it was necessary for me to be about my Father's business? In that sentence, the 12-year-old boy demonstrates the profound understanding of his identity and purpose. He knows He is the Son of God. And he makes it very clear that his Father's business is his business. Jesus is not being rude. The consciousness of who he really was did not prevent Jesus from performing normal, lowly, daily tasks of life, and from being obedient to his earthly parents. We know this because verse 51 tells us he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was subject to them. He humbly goes home with his parents and submits to them. In this introduction to the life of Jesus, we have the first recorded words that ever came from the mouth of Jesus. We read it in Luke in verse 49. Did you not know I must be about my Father's business? The last recorded words that Jesus ever spoke were about the work that God had given him to do. And we find this in John 19 and verse 30. And this was Jesus on the cross. He said, "It is finished." And bowing his head, he gave up the spirit. Between those two verses is the greatest story ever told. There was still a few years left for Mary and Joseph to nurture this growing young man. Jesus stayed close to his parents, a period long enough for him to learn Joseph's carpentry trade and to support Mary with it, until he was about 30 years old. Now this is the last time that Joseph is mentioned in the Gospels. It's generally believed that he died during the early years of Jesus, while Jesus was still just a youth. This would leave the care of the family in the hands of Jesus. Something else that we don't usually think about. There were other members in the family. Jesus had brothers and sisters. Jesus was brought up in the heart of a big family. From Mark chapter 6 and verse 3, we learn something else. And there's so much that we can learn from just this one verse. Mark chapter 6 and verse 3. Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? The title that's given to Jesus, the carpenter, the son of Mary, from this we can safely assume that by this time Joseph had died, because Jesus is now the carpenter, the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon. Are not his sisters here with us? 4 brothers, and we don't know how many sisters. This was a large family. For some 18 years after that visit to Jerusalem, Jesus appears to have lived and toiled as a carpenter in Nazareth. As the years went on, Jesus grew from being a boy to a young man. He grew too in knowledge and in wisdom, and in favour with God and man. Jesus learned the trade of a carpenter with Joseph. Joseph had died while Jesus was still a young man, and Jesus, as the oldest son, would have to take care of his mother and his younger brothers and sisters. So with the work of the carpenter's shop, and the quiet life of a country village, and the worship in the local synagogue, the years passed by until Jesus was 30 years of age. There are few places where human nature can be studied better than a small village. Because in that sort of close community we see so much of people's individual lives. Everyone knows everyone else's business. The account that we have of the early years of Jesus is very concise. There may not be enough to satisfy our curiosity, but there is enough to help us to adjust our conduct. The only authentic record that we have of just what happened during those childhood years we find in verses 51 and 52. Then he went down to them and came to Nazareth and was subject to them. But his mother kept all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favour with God and man. It's well worth taking note of the way that Jesus grew. Jesus grew in wisdom, intellectually. He grew in stature, physically. He grew in favour with God, spiritually. And he grew in favour with man, socially. The development of Jesus was the same as all of us need to develop. This shows Jesus to be one of us. This marks his life on earth as progressive, passing through successive stages. Jesus had to learn as others learned, subject to the ordinary growth and development of human knowledge. Jesus Christ is the great pattern, and he's the one that we are to use for our example. We should never be at a loss to know what we should do. He is our example. We need to know either what he did or what he would have done in any situation that we may find ourselves in. Though Jesus was the Son of God, he was also the Son of Mary. And he loved and obeyed his mother. He was subject to her. Nazareth was a notoriously wicked town. We learn from the question that was asked, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? Jesus had no association with sin in his own life. But in Nazareth, he would see the awful problems that sin caused. This was going to be something that would be his life's work to deal with. He was still further brought into contact with human nature by his trade. He worked as a carpenter in Joseph's shop. There can be no doubt. Is not this the carpenter? There's something else that we really need to take on board. Of all the jobs that God could have chosen for his son when he dwelt among men, out of all the possible positions to which he could have placed him, he chose the lot of a working man in a working class family. Jesus is made aware of the needs and feelings of the multitude of people that he'd come to minister to. As Jesus grew up in Nazareth, this is what we read in verse 30, and the child grew and became strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. The rest of Jesus' youth and early masculinity is summed up by Luke in one short verse, verse 52. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favour with God and man. The two verses 40 and 52 give us the only real sound basis for what happened during those silent years. Now in verse 39 we find a clue on how verse 40 came about. This is what we read in verse 39. So when they had performed all things according to the law of the law, they returned to Galilee, to their own city, Nazareth. It would be in the home of Mary and Joseph. It would be their influence that played a part in just how the child grew. And the child grew and became strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. Again, verse 51 sheds light on what took place. Verse 51 tells us, then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was subject to them. But his mother kept all these things in her heart. It would be what was going on around Jesus that would have the greatest impact on the life of Jesus. And that's why it's so important that we understand something. Not just what was going on around him, but how he reacted to those things. Jesus increased in wisdom and stature, and in favour with God and man. What are the lessons that we can learn from those silent years? During those silent years, Jesus would experience all those situations that all human beings experience. He would grow the same way as all of us grow. He would face exactly the same problems that we all face. Learning a trade. All those work-related problems that we face, he would face. Would he be able to earn enough to feed the family? And then there'd be all those family problems. Not just the provision of the material needs. There would be sorting out personal family problems. He would experience all the family problems that we experience. He was, in all points, tempted as we are. Just think of all the problems that you've experienced down the years. Jesus has experienced most of them and more. Hebrews couldn't be any clearer. In Hebrews 4:15 it tells us, "For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, and yet without sin." To be like Jesus should be the aim of every Christian. To follow the example that he set for us. The example of those silent years is clear enough. This is all we need to know. Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favour with God and men. That is what we should all be striving to do. Now that's where Luke chapter 2 finishes. Then Luke takes more than 20 verses to introduce John the Baptist. John the Baptist played such an important part in the life of Jesus. There are so many things that we can learn by looking closely at John the Baptist and his relationship with Jesus. And this is what we shall be looking at, God willing, in the next session. Now just a little further information for you, if you're interested. If you type into your computer, "Seeking the Truth" with Alan Rigby, this should bring you to my webpage. From here you should be able to download the video and a transcript of each session. These transcripts could be helpful. Cut and paste is much easier than note-taking. And if, like me, you have an hearing impairment, you'll have a copy of each session to read. Now until the next time, the Lord bless you all.